Good morning, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our participants, guest speakers, and organizers. I hope everyone is having a great time. So today we'll be having the 10th episode of our BRSL webinar series entitled Plants, Communities, History, and Archaeology, brought to you by the Biological Research and Services Laboratory of the Natural Sciences Research Institute, University of the Philippines, Diliman. In today's episode, we have invited two guest speakers to provide their expertise in their respective fields of interest. So I hope everyone has their snacks and coffees while enjoying today's episode. This is your host, John Paul F. Tosok, a University Research Associate at BRSL. So before we start, let us first have our national anthem.
Bayang magiliw, perlas ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiging, sa manlulupi, di ka pasisihin, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bakaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang kisap ng matawat mo'y tagumpay na nagtitinig, ang bituin at araw na kailan pa may magdidilig, lupa ng araw ng walhati pagsinta, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mga api, mamamatay lang dahil sa'yo.
Just to remind our participants of our house rules, please turn off your microphones and video cameras. Only use the chat box for posting questions and comments. And lastly, respect the speakers by listening attentively. For our opening remarks, let us all welcome NSRI Director Dr. Elmer S. Estacio.
Thank you. Just a moment. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This, I was informed, is now the 10th episode of the Biological Research and Services Laboratory webinar series for 2021. The BRSL's efforts in continuing to disseminate scientific knowledge despite the setbacks brought about by this pandemic is truly inspiring. In this afternoon's webinar entitled Plants, Communities, History, and Archaeology, showcases the laboratory's resolve to diversify in its expanding area of content. Today, we have two distinguished resource speakers. Dr. Jasminda Seron will talk about how plant evidence may be used to draw a historical and archaeological perspective on the origin and spread of agriculture in Southeast Asia, while Professor Maria Mercedes Planta will talk about the impact of the Royal Botanical Garden in 19th century Manila. This botanical garden, which was initially established as a center for research and development, went on to instigate social, cultural, and economic significance. I congratulate and applaud Dr. Pirangeli Vital and the very able BRSL staff for yet another impending webinar success. I thank the resource speakers for sharing their valuable time and expertise to a virtual audience who nonetheless, despite being virtual, are craving for new and interesting scientific knowledge. Lastly, to the 100 or so participants who will be joining us from as far away as Vietnam, the US, and Ireland, allow me to welcome you all to this afternoon's BRSL webinar. Maraming salamat po. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Estacio, for that warm welcome. We hope our participants will enjoy, learn a lot, and be inspired in today's episode. So, first up, for our talk number one, our speaker is Dr. Maria Mercedes G. Planta. She is a professor of history at the Department of History, University of the Philippines, Diliman, where she also holds the title of University Scientist 1. Her area of expertise is the history of medicine in colonial Southeast Asia. She is currently the deputy editor of the Regional Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, an international peer-reviewed journal in English that seeks to provide a platform for Southeast Asian scholars based in the region to share their research internationally. She is also the author of the award-winning book Traditional Medicine in the Colonial Philippines, 16th to the 19th Century, for the best book in science by the National Book Awards of the Philippines. Let us all welcome Dr. Planta. Dr. Planta, you may now start your presentation. Thank you.
Um, Let me just share screen. Good afternoon, everyone. Um, okay na ba yung audio ko?
Okay
I
na po.
Okay. So I want to thank the BRSL lab for inviting me, and to NSRI for giving me an opportunity to be part of your webinar series. My presentation this afternoon is actually is subject that has been a result of my long-standing work. So I will show you my book. So this book is on traditional medicine in the colonial Philippines, and I have worked on this topic for the longest time. And in many instances, I have always thought that I can lay the book to rest. But apparently there are the possibilities for research for my work has not yet ceased, and for which I am very grateful. Anyway, so my talk this afternoon is on the Real Jardín Botánico. The quote, "The great in the little world," is taken from the work of Linnaeus, who is the cornerstone of modern day botany. The idea of gardens is, as a colonial undertaking, is not new to Southeast Asia or even to the Philippines. So this is the abstract that I wrote. In Southeast Asia, the earliest botanical garden that was established is found in Bogor in Indonesia, which is their little Baguio for Filipinos. This is a cool place. This was founded by Sir Stamford Raffles when Indonesia came briefly under British rule. So this is the Singapore Botanical Gardens, the most beautiful garden, well maintained in the region, and also founded by Sir Stamford Raffles, the founder of Singapore, when Singapore was still part of the British colony in Southeast Asia called British Malaya. This is the Vietnam Botanical Garden, founded under French rule in 1865. At the time, Vietnam was still referred to as Cochin China. So this is both a botanical garden and a zoo. And this is another garden in Penang, so under Malaysia, under British Malaya. And this is now the Perdana Botanical Gardens in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, in 1889, established by the British. And this is our Real Jardín Botánico, established in 1858 by a royal order at the time under Governor General Fernando Norsagaray. A botanical garden is a Western conception that was brought to the Philippines by Spain and by other colonial powers in the region. So the botanical garden in Manila that was built by Spain has evolved to become the Mayhan Garden. Under American rule, the Americans decided it was better off a park than a garden. So of the botanical gardens founded in Southeast Asia by colonial powers, only the Philippines has been lost to us, at least in the sense of having a botanical tradition. So if you go to Manila, you will not miss Mayhan Garden because it is beside an ugly place that's built by a Manila mayor called Park and Ride. So that was the original site of the of the Royal Jardín Botánico, renamed as Mayhan Garden after John Mayhan, who was the supervisor of parks under the American colonial period. So according to Linnaeus, who undertook or established a system for classifying plants, what is the purpose of bringing plants or collecting plants? So physic gardens, according to Linnaeus, are cultivated at academies where the plants of various kinds are collected from all over the globe, that we may by this means behold, as it were, the great in the little world. They tend to this end that though we may be confined to one spot, one corner of the earth, we may examine the great and various stores of knowledge, and therein behold the immense domain of nature, and get acquainted with such things as otherwise must be sought for and oftentimes in vain over the whole globe. So people who are studying botany, we are thankful because Linnaeus provided us with a system, one unified system for classifying plants. But the other side to it, botany was a colonial creation, was developed and facilitated under colonial rule. And interestingly, Linnaeus, who established a system of botanical classification, came from a country that did not even have a colony. In one of his one of the things that Linnaeus actually did, which is quite funny, was that he tried to transport tea from Asia into the frigid cold of Sweden, and he never succeeded. But this is taken from an oration concerning the necessity of traveling in one's own country, where species from different parts of the world, plant species, will be brought and acclimatized. And it is as if in Linnaeus' vision, he will have a piece of the little world in his tiny place called Sweden. The impetus for the building of the Real Jardín Botánico was actually in the period of the 18th century under Governor General Jose Pasco y Vargas. By this time, the Spaniards had finally decided it is time to make a serious effort to make money from the Philippines. So Basco was sent, he was a Governor General in the Philippines from 1778 to 1787. And he had a 5-year economic development plan that was centered on agriculture. For Basco, the key to economic development in the Philippines was through the strategic command of agriculture that could yield products that will be of value for export. So when Basco undertook this project of economic development, he also instituted two organizations. One was the Real Sociedad Económica del Amigos del País, or Royal Society of the Friends of the Country, and the Real Compañía de Filipinas, or the Philippine Royal Company. The Philippine Royal Company is a trading company in the tradition of the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company in Indonesia. These two organizations were intended to be the implementors of Basco's agricultural economic plan for the Philippines. The Royal Society of the Friends of the Country will be composed of intellectuals who were based in the Philippines and would think of ways to develop certain plants for economic use. Foremost of this would be cinnamon and coffee and tobacco. And the Philippine Royal Company would take charge of the production and shipment and industrial development of these plant resources to be brought to Madrid. This is a photo of the Royal Botanical Garden in 1858. So we are the last country in Southeast Asia to have established a botanical garden. This was a brainchild of Juan de Cuellar, who was the first Spanish botanist sent to the Philippines in 1785 by Charles III. Interestingly, Juan de Cuellar was not only sent by Charles III, but he was given the title of a royal botanist. However, he was a royal botanist with no compensation. Roy, sin sueldo. That was what he was. His role in the Philippines, his expenses in terms of developing the botanical potentials of the Philippines would be charged to the crown, but he doesn't get any compensation for it. So by this reality, looking at it, we might as well ask ourselves, what is really the value of how did the Spain envision an agricultural development plan to lift the economic potential of the Philippines when the very person who was supposed to be at the helm of this undertaking did not really receive any compensation at all. Of course, he was well provided for, but that was just it. No salary of any sort. Cuellar was not just an ordinary botanist, he was actually a pharmacologist. So not just someone who dispenses medicine, but someone who dialogues with medical people to, to, to understand how medicines would interact in the human body. Juan de Cuellar envisioned the building of a royal botanical garden, but it did not materialize during his time because he was sent in 1785. He died in the Philippines, but never saw the completion of his vision for this botanical garden. But he was sending all sorts of specimens to Madrid. He was obsessed with developing cinnamon. So eventually, this is the site. This is Old Manila. And here, you can find east of Intramuros, the site of the Royal Botanical Garden in Manila. Here is Juan de Cuellar, who was the first botanist sent to the Philippines. At that time, the most colonial powers were obsessed with obtaining the holy trinity of spices. That's what they called it, the cloves, nutmeg, and mace. If one wonders what are these for, initially we would know that these are spices. At the time before refrigeration and handling of food was not yet well developed. Spices had the purpose of preservation and flavoring for food, but actually nutmeg and mace is considered to be quite valuable for the elites, primarily because they have hallucinogenic properties. So probably that's why it is very attractive for Europeans especially. Why are these the holy trinity of spice? Because these are the most important. Cloves are also for flavoring, but also for smoking. If you go to Indonesia, Indonesian cigarette called kretek is actually made out of cloves. The search for spices was so important. Spices were considered as equal to gold. So a boatload of spices is equal, the value is equal to a boatload of gold. This is cinnamon that Cuellar was so obsessed with. The Dutch had a monopoly of cinnamon production in Indonesia, and the Spaniards were so obsessed in taking that monopoly. The idea of cinnamon acquisition is filled with so much myth and so much romantic drama to it. In fact, Pliny the Elder, who wrote one of the first encyclopedias in the world, described how cinnamon was transported. It was not necessarily from Africa, but actually from Ethiopia. Oh, not from Arabia, but from Ethiopia. And it was transported from Ethiopia to Arabia, according to Pliny the Elder, carried on rafts with no sails or oars, powered by man alone and his courage. That means people went to such lengths to take cinnamon. So the Botanical Garden in Manila, the first most significant director was Sebastian Vidal y Soler, who put a systematic scientific ordering of the collections in the Botanical Garden. So the Botanical Garden was an economic undertaking. Unlike the tradition of botanical gardens in the West, at least in the Philippines, botanical gardens in the West were actually built alongside agricultural and medicinal schools. for the purpose that medicines would be developed from the garden to be sent to the medical schools and cultivated by agriculturists. So they come as one entity. Apart from the vision that, of course, it is a place of leisure and to bring a part of heaven into earth. So if you look at the botanical gardens in the West, especially those of the old tradition, they have that vision of bringing a little piece of heaven on earth. But in the Philippines, the Real Jardín Botánico was primarily for an economic purposes. Cultivation of potential spices, food crops, and timber. These are some of the things that were grown in the botanical garden. So, So this is cinnamon. This is coffee. Coffee. The Philippines was the first country in Southeast Asia to have coffee brought to it by the Spaniards. In the 17th, 1800, there was an international coffee blight, and only the coffee in the Philippines survived. So if you go to Batangas, the coffee in Batangas is Liberica. It dates back from the period of Spain and brought economic development and economic prosperity to Batangas because of this export. So in the Visayas Island, you have sugar. In Batangas, one province alone, it was coffee. And at one time, at the height of the coffee blight, Batangas supplied the only source of coffee in the world. This is cacao or chocolate, because the Spaniards thought we could actually make a case for chocolate imports. This is cotton. This would be especially valuable because it was, when you distill it, there's alcohol in it for industrial use. This is tobacco. This is mulberry tree. The Spaniards also envisioned that we could rival China in silk production. This is betel. This has really no economic value of the likes of these other plants, but betel is a very important plant in Southeast Asia for purposes of ritual, as a symbol, and as an indicator of social status. So the story of betel in Southeast Asia has its own quality that is as fascinating as any of the spices that the Spaniards were obsessed with in cultivating. The botanical garden also had the Spaniards in the Philippines were obsessed with obtaining or planting the cinchona tree, which is the source. The bark is the source of quinine at the time. That was believed to be a cure for malaria. The quinine. At that time, people thought malaria was from the Spanish word malaria, meaning bad air. Initially, people did not realize it was transmitted by mosquitoes, but they thought it was just bad air. And this, all the way from Latin America, the cinchona tree was imported to the Philippines. If you look at the transport of products from the Philippines to Spain, how plants were packaged, how they were brought from overseas travel. This is a very interesting undertaking, especially when one realizes there was no means of transportation as we have now, no means of communication as we have now. But because the cinchona tree could not be propagated as much as the Spaniards had wanted, they explored the dita tree, which they thought could be an alternative to the cinchona tree as a means to produce or derive quinine for malaria. The plants in the Real Jardín Botánico, I have separated the medicinal plants from the entire collection, but the thrust of the entire collection, the inventory of plants of the Real Jardín Botánico, was designed for economic purposes. Many botanical gardens in the region, such as the Singapore Botanical Garden, also had economic purposes. But the economic undertaking or vision that drove the Real Jardín Botánico was unparalleled in the sense that the Spaniards, that was their only concern. So instead of developing other products, their intention was only to develop these products find ways to ship them to Spain, to acclimatize them, and to develop them, and be part of what they call the cash crops, or products that could yield monetary value in a colony that was becoming more of an economic burden. So in the context of the Philippines, the idea of colonial botany and how it served colonial rule could have been possible if not for the fact that the Spaniards did not really pay so much attention to its undertakings that always had promising beginnings. Yun lang po. Thank you. Okay, I'm done.
Can we give Dr. Planta some heart and applause react? Thank you so much, Dr. Planta.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that extensive discussion on the connection between botanical science, commerce, and empire building through the Spanish scientific and botanical undertakings here in the Philippines. So before I introduce our next speaker, I would like to encourage everyone, if you have any questions regarding the presentation, feel free to send them through our chat box. Thank you. Next, for our talk number 2, our second and last speaker is Maria Jasminda Liza Arceron. She finished her BA in Anthropology and MA in Archaeology at the University of the Philippines. She then went to the University of Otago in New Zealand, where she received her PhD in Archaeology. Her research interests are focused on archaeological plants, cultural studies, ethnography, and heritage management. She and her postgraduate colleagues at the Museum Studies in the University of the Philippines created an education program for grade school pupils at San Vicente Public School in correlation with museum and communities. She was also part of the team that started to build a community museum at Subaltan, Palawan in 2010 during the University of Washington Archaeological Field School in collaboration with the Archaeological Studies program of the University of the Philippines Diliman, or UPASP. She also had help in curating some exhibitions of the UPASP. Her career has been devoted to teaching and research since she earned her bachelor's degree. As an educator, she taught at the ICC colleges and Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Marikina as a social science instructor. She also became part of the roster of faculty as a senior lecturer at the UPASP. In the field of research, she was part of the medical anthropology team of Fern Incorporated. She joined various local and international archaeological projects, working as a student research assistant, research associate, and archaeobotany consultant in the different archaeological sites here in the Philippines, in Vietnam, and Hong Kong. Since 2012, she has worked under the archaeological projects of the Australian National University in North, Central, and South of Vietnam. Her PhD thesis is linked with the foraging to farming transition in mainland Southeast Asia, project by Professor Peter Bellwood, Dr. Mark Oxenham, and Dr. Philip Piper. Let us all welcome Jasminda. Jasminda, you can now share your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tosok, and thank you to the UPNSRI, BRSL, for inviting me to give a talk about my research. Is it okay if I turn off my video so that everyone could focus on the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay, my dissertation is linked with the Australian Research Council project of Professor Bellwood et al. And the title of the project is Transition from Foraging to Farming in Mainland Southeast Asia. One of the questions that scholars would like to answer is the subsistence strategies of the early settlers in Vietnam in the past 4,000 years, where where the early settlers of Raknui, Taklak, Luxang, and Logak were foragers or farmers. The research that I carried out is focused on archaeobotany or archaeological plants, specifically macrobotanical remains. When we say macrobotanical remains, these are archaeological plants composed of seeds, nuts, fruits, roots and tubers, and other plant parts. So these are recovered in soils and sediments through hand collection, wet sieving, dry sieving, and flotation. In Southeast Asian archaeology, the studies mostly carried out in mainland Southeast Asia are concentrated on the origins and spread of early rice farming communities, whereas in island Southeast Asia, the research done is focused on the domestication and cultivation of taro, yam, and banana. In earlier studies on cultivation and dispersal of agriculture in Southeast Asia, there is lack of concrete plant evidence of rice grain to directly suggest domestication and cultivation. Most of the materials recovered that archaeologists assume domestication and cultivation are pottery sherds with rice temper and rice impressions. When the plant recovery techniques were applied in Southeast Asian excavations in the early 60s, scholars were able to identify various plant species. Different methods were practiced, and archaeologists can recover and identify remains of domesticated and cultivated rice, as well as cultivated and domesticated roots and tubers. The orthodox view of the migration of the Austronesian-speaking people from Taiwan to island Southeast Asia and the Pacific illustrates the similarities in material culture and language. The movement is contemporaneous with agriculture. Clues of the crop package in determining the early agriculture in the bordering areas in mainland Southeast Asia are significant. Rice and millet have been recovered and appeared repetitively with similar assemblage in South and Southwest China. The wave of migration of people from China going to the different routes resulted in the breakdown of crop package in Southeast Asia. The cereals of rice and millet are obscure in the archaeological record when migration occurred towards island Southeast Asia, while the introduction of rice and millet in mainland Southeast Asia was between 4,400 BP and 3,400 BP. Scholars researching in Southeast Asia also looks at the movement of cereal agriculturalists from the southern province in China to North Vietnam, forming the Phuong Nguyen culture, and other groups had spread down and settled down to the Mekong River area in the southern part of Vietnam. The role of archaeobotany in this research will aid in evaluating the potentials of the macrobotanical remains in assessing the materials and understanding the patterns of plant utilization on the Vietnam region of mainland Southeast Asia during the Neolithic period to the Metal Ages. It highlights the question of whether data derived from the archaeobotanical remains supports the presence of cereal agriculture, whether it supports yam and aroid domestication, whether the inhabitants had direct contact with the cereal agriculturalists, or whether the archaeological plant assemblage indicates both foraging and farming at the same time. The objectives of my research are to identify the economic crops utilized by the inhabitants, to explore the potential, adaptations, and changes involved in the management of tuber trees and plants by the inhabitants, to determine whether the inhabitants of the earliest recognized and sedentary large settlements in the Vietnam region were primarily supported by cereal cultivation or retained reliance on veggiculture and foraging, to examine and understand how the early sedentary human populations manage their environments, and lastly, to present significant new insights into the origins and development of agricultural systems of mainland Southeast Asia. I participated the archaeological excavations in Raknui, Luxang, and Logak, located in the southern part of Vietnam, and Taklak in 2015, which is situated in north-central Vietnam. The data included in the study are from the recovered archaeological plants and the first-hand information I gathered during the ethnographic research and plant collection in 2016 from the 4 study areas. The archaeological plants were recovered through wet sieving using 1 to 2 millimeter aperture mesh, hand collected, and flotation. Flotation is the process of separating the plant remains by washing the soil with water. We hang the samples and dry them for a few days, place them in a bag, and analyze the floated samples in the lab. In the analysis, I sorted and separated different plant materials and count them. I identified the archaeological plants using modern plant comparatives from the herbarium and modern plants that I collected, and from the published materials. I did SEM analysis and described and measured the cells of the roots and tubers for ID. Photographing the archaeological plants is necessary for reports and publications. What are the plant materials in the 4 archaeological sites in Vietnam? So let me first present the plant remains in Raknui. The Raknui site is located in Long Tan Commune in the district of Cang Duc in Long An Province, South Vietnam. The site is situated near a marshland that connects to Vam Co River. The term Rak refers to the branch of a river, whereas Nui means a mountain. The Vietnamese usually refer to a mound as a mountain, so the place means river in the mountain. Raknui was excavated in 1978 and 2003 by the team and collaborated between the Institute of Social Sciences in Ho Chi Minh City and the Department of Culture and Information in Long An Province. In 2012, excavation was carried out by the team of the Australian National University in collaboration with the Center for Archaeological Studies, Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences in Ho Chi Minh City, and the Long An Provincial Museum. So we excavated 4 trenches, trench 1, 2, 3, and 4. Here is the short video of the area of Raknui site. When I went back in 2016 to collect modern plants and do ethnography, my Vietnamese colleagues and I noticed a newly built structure, this structure, on top of the trenches that we excavated. So this was trench 1, the footpath, and this is trench 2. So here are the archaeological plants that I identified. We recovered 3 petrified areca nut, or which is commonly known as betel nut. These were recovered at trenches 1 and 2 through wet sieving by Professor Bellwood and the locals who were helping us in the excavation. During the 2012 excavation in Raknui, I already noticed that there are elderly who still practice betel nut chewing. We also went to the Raknui market, and some vendors sell areca nut, betel leaf, lime paste, and tobacco. In 2016, I interviewed a few Vietnamese participants between 60 to 70 years of age I noticed that there is art in folding the betel leaf and cutting and slicing the areca nut. Betel nut chewing has been part of the Vietnamese culture, where some subgroups use betel nut as a gift during matrimonial ceremonies. Betel nut chewing is a common practice in Asia and Polynesia. So Zumbrugh, he synthesizes that the beginnings and dispersal of the habit of betel nut chewing is complex based on the archaeological and linguistic evidences. Linguistic analysis on betel pepper demonstrated that there is more research done in Austronesian languages as compared in mainland Southeast Asia. There are ethno-historical accounts that describe the integration of betel nut into cultural practices, such as in the Philippines, which was part of the customary ways more than 4,000 years, but no specific evidence as to when the areca nut use became part of each culture. In South Asia, textual sources validate that areca nut and the betel leaf were not native to southern India. The introduction of the plant was around 1,500 BCE. After 500 BCE, there was local and long-distance trade across the Indian subcontinent. The usage of betel quid in India became part of their way of life and medicinal practice. In countries like Cambodia, the Philippines, and the Mariana Islands, it is evident in the archaeological record that betel chewing is illustrated in stained dentitions. Calculus formation and abrasion are apparent in the samples and shell containers that contain slake lime. Identified from the core samples, the lake near Chang in southern peninsula in Thailand, where pollen of areca dating 6,600 to 4,000 BP proves the presence of the plant. Cultivation of areca, catechu, and piper species was after 1,500 BP, based on the pollen record. The earliest archaeological evidence of betel nut usage in mainland Asia is in northern Vietnam. There were dentitions at the Nui Nap site ranging from 3,000 to 1,700 BP. And further study of the maxillary incisor with dark reddish stains dated that remains, the date backs to 2,400 to 2,000 BP. Recovered at Gyeongkabo, associated with Sawin culture, is another archaeological evidence of dentitions dating about 2,500 BP in Vietnam. At Phu Chan's site, situated along the tributaries of Dong Nai River, there was an areca nut found inside a Heger drum, along with other grave goods, such as mirror from the late Western Han period, which dates around 2,202 to 9 BCE. Another fruit is the mineralized nipa fruit, recovered in Trench H3. This type of plant still exists in the surrounding area of Raknui. The fruit is edible and it tastes like coconut. The local community in Raknui eat the fruits of nipa apart from the use of leaves in making the roof and walls of the house. Canarium nut was part of the human diet by the early settlers in Raknui. They processed the nuts by heating the nut shells to release moisture and crack the hard nut shells. Dr. Castillo had identified foxtail millet in Trench H1 and rice husks. In Trench H2, there was a fragment of charred rice grain. Apart from the fruits, nuts, and cereals, there is also Archaeological Parenchyma of Yam. So Deoscarea or yams of Deoscareaceae family have a large genus with about 600 species and around 50 to 60 cultivated species. The distribution of the plant is in the tropical, subtropical, and temperate regions in Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, West Africa, areas of Central America, and the Caribbean. Yams are tuberous plants, and the plant produces edible tubers, bulbils, corms, and rhizomes. And some of the species are aerial tubers. The root and tuber crops are edible and considered as another staple food source, considered as a medicinal plant and an important cash crop. crop. The harvest of cultivated yams is between 6 to 12 months. However, the environment where the yam grows varies, and it can be classified as an invasive plant. The flesh of the tuber differs in color and shape. The tubers of wild Deoscarea are a good source of protein, lipid, fiber, starch, calcium, iron, phosphorus, and have vitamins A and C. A species of yam known as the wild variety is the Deoscarea hispida. So two types of yam, or two species of yam, were identified in Raknui, the Asia bitter yam and the greater yam or purple yam. Wild tubers of yam are carefully processed since it has dioscorides and cyanides. And processing the tuber to remove the toxins has been practiced even in the past. The cooking of the tubers is commonly boiled or roasted, recovering such plants. Parenchymatous tissues reveals that the peel was removed before eating, and the waste, the pericarp, and excess mesocarp was discarded and burnt. And some could have been burnt during the roasting process. The past and present communities in Vietnam was and still practicing betel nut chewing, consuming nipa fruit, cereals like rice, Canarium nut, and wild and cultivated yams. For the non-food plants assemblage, I incorporated analyzing the petrified and wood charcoal. I primarily asked help from the UPFPRDI for ID, and they provided me with the family and genus. During my anthropology training with Emily, she told me that I can identify the archaeological wood into species level. So I reanalyzed the samples. The petrified wood is composed of bamboo, white guta, agar wood, and mangrove tree species of Rhizophora and Bruguera. And this wood were part of the house in Trench H1, H2. In Trench H1, we collected 13 specimens of wood charcoal from the burnt house post features. 3 were unidentified since the wood was highly carbonized, and the diagnostic features are unidentifiable. 2 species of wood were ID'd. These were white guta and agar wood. When Dr. Castillo analyzed the floated samples in Trench 1, she noticed insect frass. Ito yung mga dumi, tain ng insekto. So this correlates with the wood identification because agar wood and white guta are evergreen trees that they are non-resistant to termites. In Trench H2 or Trench 2, I selected 20 contexts with lots of charcoal. 400 wood charcoal from each context was randomly selected for analysis. So the carbonized wood in Trench 2 assemblage is composed of white guta, agar wood, bamboo, dipterocarp, canarium, and mangrove tree species. The wood species from the mangrove dominates the assemblage and shows the early step of land clearing before the settlers built a house. Apart from the land burning, the area for clearing the vegetation, they also prefer the wood to use as a fuel. The abundance of this species reflects the surrounding environment in the archaeological site. The early settlers had collected wood in the immediate zone. The other non-mangrove wood species tells us that the collection of wood was extended outside the catchment area, having diverse wood species like evergreen, dipterocarp, and bamboo. So the Canarium fruit and wood ID in the assemblage illustrates that the fruit and wood were both utilized. The wood collection was from midward, landward, and terrestrial zones. The frequency of species identified reflects the abundance in the past environment in trenches H1, 2, 3, and 4. There were several anthropogenic factors involved in the burning of the wood, and these are clearing of the area as a start of permanent settlement. Wood was gathered as fuel to burn shells to make a slake lime of betel nut chewing or making compacted clay floorings for the house. The utilization of wood as fuel for cooking, such as roasting and smoking fish. Wood was also gathered as fuel for firing the potteries. Wood was used as a tool, and either it was intentionally or accidentally burnt. And wood was dismantled, the dismantled timber used as construction material and burnt before site abandonment. Cultural perception of preferentially selected wood affects wood selection. For example, the use of macdan and wood from the mangrove, since it has a good fuel quality. The participant in Raknubi mentioned to me that they collect different types of wood that they collect in the immediate zone that they use for rice wine making. So what does these archaeological plant remains in Raknubi tells us? So fruit, nuts, and tubers were collected, processed, and consumed. The early settlers were knowledgeable in managing their landscape by collecting wild yams and cultivating yam at the same time. They were trading products with the neighboring groups to avail rice and millet. They were managing their resources from the mangroves, dipterocarps, evergreen, and bamboo forests. They used wood as fuel for house construction and also for house construction and clearing of the land before they construct a house. Next site is the Luxang site. It is a mound located at the district of Dukhwa at the rural commune of Luxang. The archaeological site lies right next to the famous river of Bamkodong. The river is 140 miles that runs through the prominent river system of Dong Nai. The word Luxang means river of fortune, from the Vietnamese term Loc, which is fortune, and Giang means river. The site was surveyed by Louis Malare in the 1930s and 1988. And the Vietnamese archaeologists excavated the site in 1988, 1993, and 1996. We excavated the site in 2014, and we opened, there was 2 test pits that was dug to test the extent of the preservation of the Neolithic materials across the site. And 1 trench was opened, and we recovered animal bones, stone tools, potsherds, with rice impressions and husk tempers. So the site dates back to 4,000 to 3,300 calibrated BP. Here are the plant remains. So there was not enough botanical assemblage preserved and recovered. The plant remains identified were a few seeds of spot panicled flowers, or the Acmella paniculata. This type of weed grows in agricultural land, and there is no direct evidence that the weed was consumed or used as medicine. And we also recovered a fragmented rice grain, a charred spikelet base, and silicified rice husk. So the presence of rice suggests that the early settlers of Luxang engaged in trading to acquire rice for consumption, and the husks were used for pottery production. Possibly, the processing of the crop was carried out near the area where the pottery was manufactured. The third site is Logak. It is a habitation site situated at Vinh Tri Commune in Vinh Hung District, South Vietnam, next to the west bank of Vam Cotai River. The site was occupied from the Iron Age to pre-Ocio period. There was a kiln, according to one of the archaeologists, there was a kiln for making bricks in the area where Logak acquired its name. Logak was discovered and surveyed in 1989, and there was an excavation in 2003, 2006. They recovered various materials such as ceramic sherds, animal bones associated with the occioculture. In 2012, the Southern Institute of Sustainable Development excavated the site and recovered midden deposits and floors. And in 2014, we went there to excavate the site. This is the Lugak site. It is a habitation site. And at the back, you will see that is the Lugak River, which is very important during that time. So here are the archaeological plants. We recovered our exocarp, or burnt exocarp of Morassi. The determination is low, and the identification cannot go further than the family level, as several trees and shrubs are belonging to the Morassi family. The genus Artocarpus has 50 types, and the confidence to determine the genus lacks since it requires comparative samples of the Morassi groups. The archaeological specimen of an exocarp and mesocarp resembles the thick coat of a Morassi fruit. Most of the species in the tropics and others grow in temperate areas. So the plant is deciduous or evergreen. The tropical family of plants bearing compound fruits and produces latex with milky sap. In Southeast Asia, the genus produces medium to large fruits, includes Artocarpus altilis, or the breadfruit, and Artocarpus heterophyllus, or commonly known as jackfruit. The fruit has thick exocarp and seeds embedded in fleshy fruits. There are 50 species found in tropical and subtropical Asia, and 14 species in China. So the problem encountered in this identification of the exocarp of the archaeological sample is the lack of exact reference to determine the plant genus and species. However, considering if the fruit is paper mulberry or the Grusonecea papyrifera, humans could transport it from China, and the species was introduced to Vietnam. The fruits and leaves are edible and have medicinal properties. We also identified Canarium, which is commonly known as cham in Vietnamese vernacular name. Next, we have different rice weeds found. These rice weeds are found in upland and indicate dryland cultivation. We also have the sedge nutlets, the scirpus, and it suggests that the plant was brought intentionally to the site when the reeds were collected for use in mat and basket weaving. There were remnants of reed plant impressions in archaeological floors in trenches H1 and H3 analyzed by Cameron, and this supports that the recovered actual sedge nutlets in the botanical assemblage that the plant was used. We also recovered cultivated yams in Lugak site. So Deoscarea alata, also known as greater yam, is a twinning herbaceous vine which is cultivated in Southeast Asia and distributed in the tropics, which includes Southeast Asia, Africa, Papua New Guinea. So the Deoscarea alata produces a single tuber, and the shape is cylindrical. The flesh of the tuber has white to purple with a mild sweet taste. There were few barnyard millet found in trench H1 in Lugak, and I followed the millet atlas of Professor Dorian Fuller. So the Coreopsis of Eclinoa species, or the barnyard millet, has a wider, small, and obovate hilum, and the length is about 15 to 20% of the grain. The scutellum is deep, straight in lengthwise section, longer than half, similar to the Setaria species. So the barnyard grass has plump and ellipsoidal shape. The length width of the Eclinoa species from the site of Logak is between 67.8 to 73.8%. The embryo length ratio is 71%, and the helium breadth ratio is 16.70. So this is an annual tufted grass or perennial tufted grass. The species normally grows in aquatic and moist environment. So Eclinoa colonna species are widely distributed in the tropics and subtropics. And this is commonly found in upland rice. So in this genus, some of the species were millet cultivated crops, either for human food or fodder. In India, barnyard millet is collected as a food source and domesticated, whereas as well as in China and in Japan. However, the Erie in Los Baños, Laguna, they have identified and reported that the Eclinoa species imitates rice in the vegetative growth stage and the main problem in upland and rain-fed rice fields. There were rice remains in Logak. These are charred and silicified spikelet base part of the rice, and these are domesticated. So how do we know if the rice is domesticated? By looking at the spikelet base. So the domesticated spikelet bases can be identified by their uneven profile, dimpled appearance, and less symmetrical scars. I went to the Erie to access the rice seeds at the gene bank. I measured the rice seeds and did sharing experimentation. The rule of thumb is to analyze 30 rice grains for each selected rice variety. So I requested to access the Oryza japonica and Oryza indica and plotted the archaeological rice measurements of the archaeological and modern rice comparative. The result illustrates that there are two types of rice cultivated in Logak. The Oryza indica type, which has the length width ratio of less than 2.2, and the Oryza japonica type, which has the ratio of more than 2. The abundance of rice, spikelet base, husk, and caryopsis in the archaeological layers in Logak illustrates that these are byproducts of crop processing. It also shows rice cultivation in Logak during the Metal Ages. The plant remains in Logak tells us that the settlers were managing the landscape through collecting and cultivating the plant resources during the Metal Ages. They were gathering and consuming tree crops and tuber crops as well. They were practicing tuber and cereal cultivation and processing of the crops. Barnyard millet grows in agricultural land as weeds and was harvested with rice and not considered as a crop. The weeds identified demonstrates a dryland system of rice cultivation in Logak. The fourth site is Taklak. It is situated at Taklak commune in Takhad district, Hating province in north-central Vietnam. Colonial surveyed the site in the 1930s. However, there was no publication of the results of the survey that was released. There had been reconnaissance in 1962 and excavations in 1963. Another excavation was carried out in 2002 by the Museum of Vietnamese History, the team from the Department of Taiwanese Language and History of Academia Sinica, and Hating Museum. From 2003 and 2004, the Department of Archaeology of the University of Social Sciences and Humanities and Hating Museum excavated the archaeological site. The research continued in 2005 and 2014. In 2015, The team from the Australian National University, in collaboration with the Anthropology Department of the University of Hanoi, Institute of Archaeology in Hanoi, and Hating Museum, we carried out the research. So these are the plant remains that we recovered. The panicled spot flower was recovered from the earliest phase of occupation of Taklak during the Queen Van period and later in the Taklak phase. This herb is common in agricultural fields and forest margins. The panicled spot flower can be eaten raw or as a vegetable and is considered to have medicinal properties. However, there is no direct evidence that the plant was consumed and used as medicine. The nutshells of Vietnam hickory were recovered throughout the archaeological sequence from Queen Van to Bao Cho. This family includes pecan nuts. They produce edible nuts, but these plants have many other uses. Another important economic plant that we recovered is the Canarium, which produces edible nuts and useful resin and wood for construction. And at the same time, we recovered areca, areca nut, or the betel nut, which is commonly chewed as a mild stimulant, and the charred fragments of coconut nutshells. And as we all know, coconut has multitude of uses. Gan have argued that cultivated coconut was spread across parts of Southeast Asia by the early Neolithic populations. So the coconut palm is a perennial crop of the family Arecaceae of the monotypic genus that grows throughout the tropics. So the distribution of the coconut palm is tropical and subtropical regions. It is native to coastal areas of Southeast Asia and Melanesia. Traditionally, the varieties of coconuts fall into the dwarf variety, cultivated throughout the world that produces fruits, and the tall classification is essential for copra production and wire fiber. The fiber could be brown from mature coconuts and fine white fiber from immature green coconuts. Coconut fruit has two different forms. The Nuicafa has triangular and elongated fruit with small egg-shaped nut surrounded by the thick fibrous husk. This form is the central morphology wild type. In comparison, the Nui Vai is a rounded fruit that has a large spherical nut within a thin husk. The latter contains sweet coconut water when unripe and classified as domestic selection, dispersed and cultivated by humans. The palm was translocated to the east of the Pacific Islands. The earliest documentation of cocos-like fruit found in New Zealand dating between 23 to 5.3 million years ago. In India, there were several fossilized fruits, nuts, and stem of cocos-like found in different areas. In other regions where the fossil remains of coconut were recovered were in Australia and South America. And to note, cocos-type pollen were identified in the sediments in the Philippines, Thailand, India, and Sri Lanka. In the archaeological record, there were remains of charred nutshells, fibers, and leaves of cocos species recovered in the archaeological matrices. Archaeological finds of Cocos nucifera are imperative in understanding the use and importance of coconut, its availability in the immediate surrounding in the past and cultivated. So coconut has many uses and benefits. And apart from the mentioned uses, the ethnohistorical record demonstrates that coconut is significant in rites and rituals in the Philippines, India, Malaysia, and Africa. used as a currency was a valuable item. It was a valuable item in exchange for other goods. The whole fruit was accepted as a real currency in the Maldives in the 1900s, while the carved of coconut shells were used as a coin in the South Pacific. According to Sewer, the source of coconut has multiple origins based on the identifying the biogeographic centers. There are debates on the origins and domestication hypothesis of coconut, whether it drifted by the ocean current or dispersed by humans. The hypothesis about unaided dispersal of coconut while remaining viable is relatively low. So DNA analysis supports the Austronesian migration, which suggests that the coconut was into different locations based on evidence of selection under human cultivation. So the center of cultivation in the Pacific was in island Southeast Asia, so the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Whereas in the Indian Ocean, cultivation took place in the southern part of India, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Laccadives. Historical and molecular records also illustrate that Austronesians and Arabs traded along the oceanic route connecting Southeast Asia and southern coastal Africa in the 14th and 16th centuries. So an exception of coconuts collected by gun in Madagascar and the Comoros Islands, indicating a genetic mixture of coconuts of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific type. The genetic studies of coconut provided evidence of prehistoric routes and colonization of the Pacific south movement and westward. So in this determination from the site, from Taklak site, the identification is at the genus level and the species is unidentified. The comparisons made with the modern burnt coconut shell is not enough. So we need further analysis for species identification. There are also remains of citrus rained in Taklak. So the genus Citrus is a flowering tree and shrubs of the Rutaceae family. The trees grow in a warm, temperate climate and are cultivated in subtropical, semi-tropical, and tropical areas. The distribution of citrus cultivar is throughout the world, and domesticates of South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, and the wild species are extant in Borneo, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Yunnan province. Tanaka's line characteristics, the partition of the possible spread and development of citrus. So the main center of origin of citrus postulated by Tanaka is in the south, which is located in India and northern Burma, while the second center is in the north of the line, which is in China. Citrus medina, Citrus reticulata, Citrus maxima, Citrus halimili, Citrus indica, Citrus latipes, and Citrus hystrix are the true species of citrus. The fruit has economic importance as food and beverage, and essential oils extracted have an important role in medicinal, cosmetics, and pest control. The citrus byproducts also have an essential use as ruminant feeds for cattle, cows, lambs, steers. Castillo and van der Veen mentioned that the morphological criteria of citrus strains and seeds are challenging to deduce the identification to species level. So the determination of the archaeological sample in Taklak is low. The archaeological remains were charred and the size shrinks when carbonized. The charred specimen was compared with the modern citrus exocarp, the Citrus japonica, and Citrus maxima were ruled out in the identification because the nature of occurrence of kumquat, the Citrus japonica, is in Southeast China. while the size and the texture of the archaeological exocarp are different from the pomelo, the Citrus maxima. The identification of the genus is based on the geography, reference sample and as well as images, but the species is unknown. There are other varieties of wild citrus species that possibly grow in northern Vietnam that were gathered and brought to the habitation site to eat and was domesticated. Therefore, further analyses must be made to identify the species of the archaeological exocarp. So the subsistence strategies in Taklak from the different phases of site occupation during the Queen Van period, Taklak phase and Baucho, was a combination of forest-based subsistence gathering of fruits and nuts. Rice could have been traded from the neighboring groups for consumption. So the few fragments of rice caryopsis that we recovered in Taklak, we could not directly say that this was an introduced domesticate or a wild variety, because it is not complete. It was fragmented. What do these plant remains tell us? So betel nut chewing was a valuable practice in Raknui and Taklak. People have used wood and gathered the wood in immediate zones and have extended the catchment area. Reeds of plants, plant sedges used for weaving in lugak. Wood was an important raw material in Raknui. Wood was wood was used for fuel and construction. Wood also tells us the past landscape that surrounds Raknui site. Some weeds grow in cultivated agricultural lands and agricultural uncultivated land. For the plant food archaeological plants, this tells us that exchanging goods to avail rice for consumption was evident in Luxang. Gathering and utilizing fruits, nuts, and tubers, practicing tuber cultivation and trading products for rice and millet consumption was carried out in Raknui. There was proof that suggests gathering and consuming fruits, nuts, and tubers and practicing root crop and cereal cultivation and crop processing in Lugak, and gathering and consuming nuts, fruits, and bartering goods in exchange for rice in Taklak. When I was conducting the ethnographic research in Vietnam in 2016, it is interesting to learn that they have stories about betel nut and rice. Particular plants are part of Vietnamese folk stories and legends. Folk literature is a form of cultural identity, similar to food, preparations, and traditional dishes, cultural practices, and many others. The legend about rice shows the value and significance of rice in Vietnamese culture and society. Like other Asian countries, the Vietnamese also have various ways of preparing and cooking rice. The concept of well-being, ginhawa, or han phuc in Vietnamese, connects to spirit and energy. I incorporated the notion of ginhawa of Salazar in this research as defined in the social customs, traditions, spiritual, food, and foodways of the Vietnamese culture. So acquiring food in the form of gathering and producing is equivalent to ginhawa, since it provides food. Eating is also equivalent to ginhawa. In separate events in the site of Lugak, Raknui, and Taklak, some families invited me to join them to commemorate the death of a family member. The belief is that the linon, the soul, will return during the Ngaygyo, the death anniversary. The soul needs nourishment and comfort through offerings. It exhibits the importance of family, relationships, connections, commemorations, prayers, landscapes, plants, and food. So a nourished body for both the living and the soul of the departed indicate hanfu, ginhawa. If you see these photos, rice has been valued and significant in the offerings. They offer rice grains, rice wine, and even steamed rice. And they also offer sticky rice apart from other foods served to the deceased relative or a family member. Moreover, as I have observed in the present and the locals of the present communities and the locals, they collect wood with as part of they collect wood based on their preferences, and the wood that they collect, they actually keep it and use it for special occasions, such as the celebrating the death anniversary. So finally, if I'm going to synthesize my research, so rice was already domesticated when introduced to Vietnam. The gathering of plant foods, subsistence production, and trade contribute to calorie consumption and dietary diversity. There was intensive rice farming in Logak during the Middle Ages. The early communities in Raknui and Logak were managing the landscape by collecting wild yam in Raknui site and cultivating yam in Raknui and Logak. The early communities in Raknui, Luxang, and Taklak were trading with the neighboring communities to acquire plant food resources such as rice and millet. So the communities in Raknui, Taklak, Logak, and Luxang had variable subsistence practices. So they were gathering plants, collection of tree crops, cultivation of yam, cultivating rice, and they were trading goods to acquire rice and millet. In contribution to the Neolithic transition and migration of the agricultural population discourse of Bellwood, rice agriculture was a mechanism of the dispersal of people from southern China to Southeast Asia. The movement of people had also diffused cultural patterns as well as the Neolithic package, such as pottery, the plant and animal domesticates. The presence and absence of rice and tubers are important indicators in understanding the hypothesis and looking at the agricultural origins and intensification. The remains of rice draw an important insight about rice cultivation, crop processing in Logak, and use of rice as food in Logak, Raknui, Luxang, and Taklak, and utilization of other rice parts, the husk, for pottery production that is commonly observed in Raknui and Luxang. The foxtail millet in Raknui that was identified by Christina is also an indicator of the introduction of millet in the region and utilized by the Neolithic settlers. Another food plant as a significant gauge of the Austronesian dispersal is the presence of coconut in Taklak. Coconut was domesticated in island Southeast Asia, believed that was transported by the Austronesians. The identified wild and cultivated tubers of yams in Raknui and Logak is another essential plant food type that also contributes to the discussion of the Austronesian homeland. The Deoscarea species, or the yams, were from South China and mainland Southeast Asia and were carried by humans towards their movement to island Southeast Asia. So these plant foods and the domesticating and cultivating knowledge require human agency to spread in various locations. So the significance of my research added new data to the existing hypotheses on exploring the dispersal of domesticates in Southeast Asia. It presented new insights into the origins of the agricultural systems. It provided new information on the development of plant management strategies in Vietnam during the Neolithic and Metal Ages. And posted new data for the key social and economic roles of other types of plants. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasminda, for that amazing discussion. Can we all give Jasminda some heart and applause react? Thank you so much for that in-depth discussion of your research work on the cultural, social, and economic systems and the transported landscapes in Vietnam in the past 4,000 years. So the next part of our webinar is the open forum. Our speakers are now ready to answer your questions. We will try to entertain as many questions as time permits. So we have here the first question from Mel Joan Dizon to Dr. Ceron. How does paleoethnobotany differ from archaeobotany? Dr. Ceron. Hello, Dr. Ceron.
Hello. Sorry, could you please repeat the question?
Hello, ma'am. The first question is from Mel Joan Dizon. How does paleoethnobotany differ from archaeobotany?
Paleoethnobotany and archaeobotany.
Archaeo. Yes.
Paleoethnobotany and archaeobotany. Okay, thank you for the question. In archaeobotany, we study plants by looking the plants that we recovered in archaeological sites. So what we do, we look at the role of plants based on how plants were used by humans in the past. Whereas in paleoethnobotany, paleoethnobotany is much more focused on studying plants in the past as well.
Hello, ma'am. Maybe we can start with a question for Dr. Planta while waiting for
Sorry,
Dr.
I'm losing my connection.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Archaeobotany and paleoethnobotany both study plant remains in the past. However, the difference is that archaeobotany is the term archaeobotany is used more in the European studies, whereas paleoethnobotany is on the American American anthropology. So we both terms can be used alternatively. Hello.
You can proceed, ma'am.
Hi, sorry.
I think Dr. Ceron is having a technical difficulty. Maybe we can proceed with the questions for Dr. Planta. Dr. Planta, are you ready for their questions?
Yes po, yes po.
Sige po. We have this. What were the motivations behind the establishment of botanical gardens?
Botanical gardens in general are were intended. Okay, sorry. Botanical gardens in general are intended to in the metropole, for instance, in Madrid, in Britain, botanical gardens are intended to be first repository of plants found within that country for collection purposes, probably medicinal purposes, or as part of a collection of curiosities. In the West, botanical gardens are generally curated. In Southeast Asia, the only properly curated botanical garden of the colonial period is the Singapore Botanical Garden. But unlike botanical gardens in the West, colonial botanical gardens are areas that serve the purpose of being laboratories for plants in the colony to be sent to the metropole. But there are also other motivations to it for rest and recreation, beauty, aesthetics, but that is a feature of a colonial botanical garden in the colony. Yun po.
Thank you, ma'am. We have another question from our participants for you, Dr. Planta. Knowing the colonial beginnings of botany and taxonomy in the Philippines, are there efforts to decolonize the study of botany and biology and biodiversity writ large in the Philippines?
When I began my work on gardens, I actually started a study on gardens. I only had imagined that gardens have which is as a laboratory of many different species, but also as a center of beauty, rest and recreation. And in France, for instance, the idea of a garden was not just for beauty and for collection of plants, but it was also in the colonial period, was also a symbol of how the French were able to control their environment and to project their power through their garden. So you have a formal garden that is of a very special kind. The French would spend money for it. But the idea of a colonial garden and the ordering of plants based on Linnaeus system is something that most people celebrate because it's really a systematic, it's organized a system. But those plants that did not fall into Linnaeus' system, most of the time we do not pay attention to them. Collectors of plants that are not trained are seen by Linnaeus as vulgars. But he said, oh, there is value in the works of these vulgarists. However, when you also think that while Linnaeus, especially for colonies like us, has ordered knowledge through his botanical classification, he has also indirectly marginalized other forms of knowledge. So when you do not fall into the category set by Linnaeus, automatically you have many burdens. You're unregistered, you're unrecognized, cannot be determined, and therefore not recognizable. So when people do research, they only want to make things efficient for themselves, not knowing that those unqualified things are also hold a particular unique knowledge that not everyone in a particular academic setting can access. So it is not for me, it is not probably not to decolonize, but probably to think about how certain knowledges of plants may be recovered, whether colonial, in colonies or in the metropole, that are in unintentionally um, disregarded because they do not qualify in a particular accepted, vetted category. Yun po.
Thank you po. We have another question for you, ma'am. From Maria Bernadette Abrera. Congratulations on your very interesting presentation. It made me recall that in Noli Metangera of Rizal, Rizal actually used the Manila Botanical Garden as a metaphor for the nation. Why could he have used the Botanical Garden as a metaphor for the nation? And Rizal's description of the garden was anemic. Was the Spanish colonial government actually interested in developing a botanical garden, or was it simply copying other colonizers?
Okay.
Lastly, what are the plants in the botanical garden?
Okay. Dr. Abrera is my dean in CSSP, and she is with my department. So I think my position when I study the Spanish period, my work is actually on the American period, but my initial work that I am still stuck with, in a good sense, stuck because there's just so many possibilities for this work. My position when I study the Spanish period is one of the greatest empires in the world only because it was one of the earliest. And we remember, in the period of the height of Spanish rule, the world was only divided by a whimsical decision by a pope that lands in one part belong to Spain, one part belongs to Portugal. So in many ways, most people think in the Philippines probably that the Spanish Empire was really such a glorious thing. Probably, because when you study the Spanish period, they also have many undertakings. The problem with Spain and Rizal's use of the garden as a place that lacks proper health, an ill place, an ill designed place, is also very critical of Spanish rule, because the promise of Spain's prospects in the Philippines would have been better had they paid more attention to the Philippine colony. On the other hand, probably you cannot blame them, because the Philippines did not hold a lot of wealth as in relation to Spanish America. We were not that wealthy, but it was not a hopeless case. Had Spain tried to make serious their commitment to develop science in the country, they sent a botanist, Juan de Cuellar, gave him a title, but never paid him a salary. When you look at the budget of the Real Jardín Botánico, the cost of the entire garden, of the maintenance of the entire garden, is equivalent to of 1,500 pesos, I think, is equivalent to the salary of everyone. I have it in my book, but I don't really remember, which is really strange, because you provide an opening, an impetus, and yet in the middle of it all, you withdraw your support, even without you saying it. So the Spain copy from many other colonies, probably because the botanical garden in the Philippines was the last in Southeast Asia, even if they were one of the earliest to come to the Philippines and one of the earliest colonial empires in the world. So it just goes to tell us, I mean, how Spain mismanaged a colony in Southeast Asia. And one way to look at it is the garden as a means to enhance knowledge on the country. Yun po. I hope I was able to answer her question.
Thank you, Dr. Planta. Also, I would like to recognize Dr. Victor Paz, who is raising his hand. Do you have any question po for our speakers?
Yes, I do. For both Merce and Mindy, who I congratulate for sharing their knowledge on these topics. But first for Merce, I agree with you as wonderful insights on the Jardín Botánico, and I just want to share that in the there's a very good illustration of the gardens at its peak, and you will notice that it has spokes, no, for promenading. So it was really a very nice public space. But my question for Merce really and Mindy, you mentioned both that in the garden they planted paper mulberry, and of course paper mulberry, as Mindy mentioned, is very famous as the associated with the silk industry. But in the older days, it was more popular as a source for bark cloth, for the production of cloth made out of the inner bark of the paper mulberry. So my question is, Merce, did you find any documents that actually pointed out that the plant prospered or grew in the garden, or was it just a plan? No? And for Mindy, I just heard it. I just want to clarify. Did you find any remains of paper mulberry in any of the four sites that you excavated in Vietnam? So those are my questions.
Who shall I answer first, or should it be Mindy?
Either of you po. I think Dr. Jasminda is still having a difficulty with her internet connection.
Okay. Many of the Spanish Empire, through Cuellar and later on to the other scientific expeditions and botanists who came to the Philippines, had many, when you read their works, they have many grand illusions about the possibilities in the Philippines for plant resources. The Royal Botanical Garden in Manila was the center of many of these identified plants that could bring profits to Spain. But the paper mulberry plant was not just cultivated in the Real Jardín Botánico. As with many other plants, certain parts of the Philippines were identified as places where these plants could be ideally propagated. So for instance, Mulberry Tree, it was supposed to be the identified place for it was Mindanao. But it never prospered because it was very vulnerable to some sort of insect. The Rima tree, which is the breadfruit that the British were so crazy about. I don't know why Cuellar was so keen on it, was identified to be suitable for planting in Parañaque. Cinnamon was ideally imagined to be set in Laguna. But as with the mulberry tree, the cinnamon variety in the Philippines never really attained the reality of the cinnamon in Indonesia. So for all intents and purposes, when you read the work of Cuellar, it is always that he was never able to fulfill the dreams of Spain at least to have dominance in cinnamon production and to wrest control of that dominance from the Dutch. Yun po. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Planta. I would like to apologize to our participants, but we already ran out of time for our open forum, but we will try to collect all of your questions and send them to our respective speakers. So, thank you so much for our speakers for answering the questions of our participants. That was such a fruitful discussion. Now we will be awarding the certificates to our speakers.
Sorry. Before, can I have just one minute?
Yes, ma'am.
Because maybe not everyone is aware that Vic Paz from Archaeology really began his career as a historian. So he was with my department when I was still a student before he moved to archaeology. So his interest in history is always, he's always been interested in history. So andito din si Ma'am Abrera. Anyway, thank you.
Hello po sa inyo. So now we begin our awarding of certificates. The Biological Research and Services Laboratory, Natural Sciences Research Institute, University of the Philippines. Diliman would like to, this certificate is given to Maria Mercedes G. Planta for having delivered a lecture entitled The Real Jardín Botánico and the Great in the Little World, Empire, Colonial Botany and Commerce in 19th Century Philippines during the BRSL webinar series, episode 10, with the theme Plants, Communities, History, and Archaeology, held on October 27, 2021. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Next is this certificate. This certificate is given to Maria Jasminda Liza Arceron for having delivered a lecture entitled Foragers or Farmers, a Shift in Subsistence Strategies in Vietnam in the Past 4,000 Years during the BRSL webinar series episode 10 with the theme Plants, Communities, History, and Archaeology, held on October 27, 2021. Thank you po.
Maraming salamat din.
For our closing remarks, let us all welcome BRSL Head, Dr. Peranjali G. Vital.
Hi, thank you so much, Paul. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am very much delighted that we are joined by a lot of experts this afternoon. So good afternoon po to all of you, and sharing also my happiness to each of you as we are now at episode 10 of BRSL's webinar offering during this time of pandemic. So just please allow me to thank the following. First, our speakers, Dr. Maria Mercedes G. Planta and Dr. Maria Jasminda Liza Arceron for sharing their expertise on plants and or botany. Admittedly, I am not a plant person, so I really learned a lot for this webinar, such as the terms archaeobotany, the role of plants in history and colonialism, and that betel nut is used as a gift for matrimonial ceremonies. So ang galing po talaga at ang dami ko pong natutunan. Another virtual round of applause, please, for our amazing speakers. And thank you po. So second, of course, this webinar will not be possible without the support of our NSRI Director, Dr. Elmer Estacio. Nakita po natin siya kanina during the welcome remarks, and the efforts of the researchers and the staff of BRSL. So another virtual round of applause, please, Fayahe, or memoji or reaction button po for all of them. All right, so our lab, Biological Research and Services Laboratory in the Natural Sciences Research Institute, University of the Philippines, Diliman, offers workshops, technical services, and performs different researches. And of course, although our lab is still physically closed due to the pandemic, we are accepting online consultations and continue to organize webinars such as these. So please feel free to email or contact us if you have biological concerns. Also, stay tuned with our BRSL Facebook page for updates. Advanced announcement of the BRSL webinar in relation to the celebration of the National Science and Technology Week next month or in November. That's next week already, November na po. I hope you could join us too. The third and last, I would like to thank all of you, our participants, and of course, experts no po, mga botanists, archaeologists, historians, ecologists. Ang sarap pa po sana magkwentuhan at makinig po sa inyong expertise, but we do not have enough time. So you come from different areas, either geographical location or field of interest, and joined us this afternoon for the BRSL webinar episode 10, Plants, Communities, History, and Archaeology. With this, I wish your days for this week be wonderful and safe. Hope to see all of you again in our future activities. Thank you very much. And I turn back over the virtual floor to Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Vital. We will now have our photo op. I would like to invite everyone to turn on their camera for our photo documentation. So I think we have 3 pages, so we will try to take every page. Brian will take a screenshot of every page here in Zoom. Brian, okay na first. Brian, okay na ba ang photo documentation? Maybe I'll take na lang po the screenshots. So first page.
Okay na po, sir.
Okay na po. Sige po. Thank you, everyone. So for our participants, please don't forget to fill out the evaluation forms to claim your e-certificates. Also, we would like to acknowledge our participants abroad and those from all over the Philippines, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao who gladly shared their time for today's episode of our webinar series. Thank you so much to our speakers and for that amazing discussion. We hope you will join us in our next episode. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy po. Thank you.
Hello. Malis na rin si Donna.
Wala na sila.
Ay. Teka, pag-usapan lang natin sandali lang yung sa yung sa November. Kasi
Si Paul na, si Dr. Tosok na ulit.
Ma'am Erna.
Ay,
Ano po po tayo sa YouTube? Wait lang po. Naka-learn po po tayo. Wait lang po.
Ay, sorry. Live pa. Paano i-end?